interesting to me that I grew up in an era where I knew what a dial tone was. If the phone rang and you answered it, no one would ask you, "Where are you?" because you were in your home. That's how it worked. Then in the 80s, people got cell phones, and it was only for rich people. But nowadays, kids as young as 7, 6, 5, 4, go down, are walking around with mobile devices. And the province of New Brunswick recently announced it was restricting the use of cell phones in schools. The province of Nova Scotia, the education minister, Becky Drouin, says they're examining this policy, and it would make sense to come up with some type of answer by the fall when the kids go back to school after the summer break. Dr. Simon Sherry is here with us, and he is, according to this news release, calling for Atlantic provinces to ban cell phones and social media in schools. Dr. Simon Sherry, thank you for doing this. I appreciate it.
I'm glad to be here.
Why an outright ban? Why get rid of the devices altogether as opposed to restricting their use?
There is a clear and concerning negative impact of these devices on our children. There's a digital displacement that's occurring in our world. These devices have crept into the sleep time that our children have. They've intruded into the social relationships that our children have. And so too, they pushed their way into our classrooms where they are creating a disruption. You want attention, concentration, memory at their best in an academic environment, and you're not going to get that exchanging Snapchats at the back of the room.
Again, with all due respect, that sounds like use and not necessarily possession of a device. And I know there's a private school in Halifax that has had a process in place for quite some time where the kids lock their cell phones up in the morning. They still are able to carry them or care for them if they don't put them in a locker. That gives parents the assurance that if the child needs the device for whatever reason, because we're a very mobile society, that it's there for them in a case of an emergency. Is there not a case to be made for that type of scenario?
We want to look at the details here. If you look at the policies in BC, Ontario, Quebec, there are nuances, but what they seem to share in common is let's get phones out of classrooms.
You could extrapolate that to say Canadian productivity is down. Let's get rid of them in the workplace too.
No objections here.
I did happen across an article, and perhaps this is not unfamiliar to you, the Harvard Gazette, with a piece back in March of 2023. And it says that, just Cole's notes or executive summary, 77% of U.S. schools moved to ban cell phones for non-academic purposes as of 2020. Here it is 2024, and we're having the discussion in Canada. Why do you think it's taken us some time to consider this?
It's high time, and I think we need leadership on this. We need a government-led initiative to make this change. The research is consistent. It shows that excessive screen time, cell phone use, social media use have links to depression, anxiety, and loneliness. On the physical health side of things, there are links to inactivity, obesity, and diabetes. There's compelling evidence that it would be good to protect our children, to safeguard their development by setting up some boundaries in a space for learning, our schools.
At your frame of research here, where is this coming from?
It comes from my office where I see the pernicious effects of these devices. It comes from me as a professor where I am in education myself. And it certainly comes from me as a parent, especially as it pertains to my 14-year-old son.
And again, I don't mean to bring other parts of the society into a conversation, but we don't live in a bubble, and it's easy to say all social media is harmful, and there's probably lots of evidence to back that up. But in other ways, it gives connections, it gives people an opportunity to reduce loneliness, all of the things that were compounded by the pandemic with isolation, the things that you and I had talked about in the past. Is there not a good side or an upside to these devices?
I agree. We don't want to demonize all screen time and all social media use. There are opportunities for connection that can emerge from these devices, and that should be acknowledged. There are educational applications to these devices as well. However, what our teenagers are doing is using these devices somewhere between 5 and 8 hours a day. And there's still the same 24 hours in the day. And so this is pushing out and displacing a lot of activities they might otherwise be doing to foster their development. I do think if you watch screens with your kid, there can be some positives that come from that. There are opportunities for social connection that emerge from these devices. But let's also look at the nature and quality of those relationships. How many people on your Facebook would help you move 8 a.m. on a Sunday? These are often weak tie relationships. They're connections, but they're not necessarily important or profound connections.
Is the evidence conclusive that these devices are addictive?
That's an interesting and a loaded question. I'm going to say that these are attention grabbing devices, that some of the smartest people in the world are vying for your attention and your children's attention through these devices, that there's a form of capitalism that clearly occurs through these devices by capturing people's attention, usually by fomenting anxiety and outrage. I think I'm going to stop short of calling it an addiction at this point, but psychology and psychiatry are increasingly interested in gaming as an addiction, pornography as an addiction. I don't think the research is there yet to call it an addiction. And there has to be some limit and some boundary on what we call addictions. And that's why there needs to be debate, research, and discussion in the field before I'm going to call this an addiction. But it certainly is an attention grabbing device.
And no doubt a distraction. I think we can all relate to that. We're not necessarily paying attention when we should be paying attention. Do you feel, and this may be a bit outside your lane of expertise, but when municipalities and governments say we're actually going to start suing social media companies, it's not necessarily the device, it's the platform, and say that this is disruptive technology that's harmful, is there a case that you could make that makes sense?
I agree. I'm certainly not a lawyer, but I've watched the lawsuit out of Ontario from the Toronto School Board directed against social media companies. I can't speak to the legal questions, but there is unequivocal harm through bullying, mental health impacts, and physical health impacts that occurs to our teens, tweens, and young adults through these devices. How that gets interpreted in a court of law, I'm not sure. But as a scientist who consumes that evidence, it's concerning. There are real impacts here. And oftentimes there's a digital distortion that starts to occur in the lives of our children where they experience themselves and their world and other people quite differently and in a distorted fashion, owing to their excessive involvement with these screens.
At the risk of laying down a political line, there are conversations being had in community and society right now about use of pronouns and whether or not parents need to have the final say. Why should governments, why should agencies or school boards step in where parents should have the final say about what their child's activity involves?
It's a good point. I don't want to live in a nanny state where the government intrudes deeply into our life. At the same time, I appreciate the roads our government builds. I appreciate the sewers our government makes. Our government should be entrusted to maintain vital infrastructure essential to the health of the population. And I believe since at least 2008, when the iPhone dropped and became ubiquitous, that this has become a vital part of public infrastructure. If you want to maintain the health of the population, you have to pay some consideration to these devices and their reach.
And as someone who's been standing at the front of a classroom, the teachers say, yes, there may be educational applications, but it is not the role of a teacher to police devices. Is that your experience? Policing of devices is almost required in order to keep the collective learning moving in the right direction?
I want to express a lot of empathy for our teachers, especially in a time where they are overworked. They have a burnout profession. Nearly all of the teachers I know have a real commitment to the well-being and the health and the education of their students. So I am uncomfortable saying, and here's one more thing you have to take on within your classroom. And this would be a contentious issue. I think it's very important as parents, as members of our society, that we back up our teachers in this regard. If we're going to ask them to take on this additional responsibility, I think we as a society should support them with what they need to affect these changes on behalf of our children.
Is this conversation nuanced, or is it cut and dry that we need to seriously address this issue and do so now?
I think the devil's in the details. You'd have to work out the specific policies. And if you lay out what BC did relative to what Ontario did, you can see there are different reasonable ways to go about this. But to me, this is not confusing. Let's get phones minimally out of classrooms and bring our practices in line with available evidence.
And finally, I guess the question is a clinical psychologist. When you're speaking with or having a session with someone, how do you regulate, control, or perhaps police cell phone usage in those moments?
For what I charge per hour, people are generally paying attention. Beyond that, it's a great interaction. It's probably one of the few interactions in a person's week or month where we are entirely engaged. I care about every word, every syllable, every pause, every breath. It's an extremely engaged interaction. And I think that's one of the reasons in 2024 that psychology is curative. It's a time where you can focus on a relationship, problems, and get undisturbed attention.
Well, I didn't check my phone once through this entire conversation, and I think living in the moment, there's a lot to be said for that and discipline. And I agree. I think we can all admit that these things have become such a vital part of our. Just remember the last time you thought you forgot your phone somewhere. That's all I'll say. Dr. Simon Sherry, thank you again.
I've enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.